Hello, and welcome back for Lecture 3. In this installment of the Definition of Risk series, we'll be talking about when a so-called risk is not really a risk. It's important to get this right. If we call something a risk when in fact it's not, time, resources, money, and anxiety are all spent combating something that is not in fact correct. And that means that we're wasting a lot of things. It also could mean that we're not actually preventing harms that we otherwise think we might be preventing. So it's important to get this right. Otherwise, we're not really good at risk management, the whole purpose of this course. So today we're going to take an example, or a series of examples, from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Now, I'm not picking on this agency. I happen to like environmental protection. I hope you do too. But the point is, by taking this as an example of how a government regulatory agency considers risk, I think you're going to gain a whole new insight into how surprising it is when the government classifies something as a risk that it doesn't mean what you think it means. So let's get started. Think back to our last lecture, in Lecture 2, where at the end of the lecture I gave you this example from the Cohasset Water Commission, where they said that the environmental level of a certain chemical was above the maximum contaminant level, or in other words, the safe dose that the EPA had set for this chemical in the water supply. I asked you to write out whether you felt safe or unsafe based on this information, whether you would allow your family to drink it or not. Then I gave you a second example of the speed limit, and I asked how many of you exceed the speed limit on a daily basis, and whether you feel safe or unsafe by doing so, or placing your family at risk by doing so. My guess is that many of you felt unsafe about the chemical. After all, we don't have as much familiarity and experience on a day-to-day basis with knowing what chemicals do as we do with driving our cars. So somehow, one risk we're willing to take, the other not. But it's more than that. How, after all, do they establish what is a risk or isn't? How do we know that given this sign that says 50 miles an hour, that going 55 is going to be dangerous? Well, I actually called the Utah Highway Commission on this to ask them, how did they set their safety specifications for the Highway Commission? Not unsurprisingly, they take into some factors that you might think contribute or cause risky driving. Things like weather conditions in the area, the average kind of car in the fleet of cars on the road at any given time in history, the bank or the turn at that specific place, any obstacles, rolling boulders, or other things like that that might in some ways encumber or make that road riskier, a bend or a turn to the road, the elevation, the slope of the road or the grade. All of these things are things that you might very commonsensically understand to affect the actual safety of that road. And based on a formula, probably too complex for me to understand, the Highway Safety Patrol and Commission sets a speed limit for the area. But here's what's interesting. When they set that limit, which is of course only based for the average car in the fleet, not the Ferrari, they then build in a safety factor to deal with the fact that they're a little uncertain about what the real safe speed is. And so they drop the speed limit by a certain percentage just for safety's sake. So for example, if they calculate based on their formulas that the safe speed on a highway were 70 miles an hour, they might drop the official speed limit to 50 miles an hour just to be extra cautious and make sure that people are safe on the road. You could drive safely at 70, they're saying, but we're going to definitely make sure you're safe at 50. Got the idea so far? Okay. With that in mind, let's turn back to the chemical examples, something we're less familiar with, to see how this might play out. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency often has decent data about certain chemicals that it suspects to be cancer-causing agents. So the title of this slide is a cancer risk low-dose extrapolation. Wow, that sounds fancy. It's not that hard to understand though. On the bottom axis of this graph, you'll see that it says dose. How much of the chemical did you get? On the vertical axis, you'll see the word risk, which is the likelihood or percentage or frequency with which you will acquire cancer as a result of exposure and acquisition of this chemical in your body. Now, most of the time when the Environmental Protection Agency gets data about this stuff, they don't actually know for low doses, that is below some certain threshold of exposure to a chemical, how that chemical affects human beings. They usually only have reliable data for very high doses of a chemical. For example, among workers working in very, very toxic environments who get high exposures to something. So you'll see here a whole series of graphs that at the top of the diagram there are some data for. These are high doses where we have high risk levels, 1% or 0.1% of increase in cancer as a result of exposure to the chemicals. The question the EPA wants to know is what's usually pertinent to society. If you get a very low dose of this chemical, parts per billion at a very small level, can that actually also cause harm? In other words, is low dose exposure to the chemical also a risk? And that's where some guesswork comes in. You'll see this blue box on your screen, this aqua blue box. And there, we don't have good data. We don't, in other words, know, thinking back to our issue about causation in the last few lectures, whether this is a possibility or not. And if it's unknown, then what I told you before is we use the word uncertainty, at least in my parlance, not risk. But here's what the EPA does. The EPA could draw a guess, based on this high-level data, what happens for cancers at low levels. So they could draw a line like this, for example. It's a guess about what sort of relationship between dose and cancer risk there is for low doses of these chemicals. That's one way they could draw the line, but they could draw it another way. And in fact, this is the way where they draw it back through the 0 point that they often prefer to do this. They draw a linear line starting with data that they do know back through the area of exposure they don't know at low doses to come up with some sort of estimate of what they call cancer risk from this chemical. Okay, let's see how this plays out. One way to look at this and caution ourselves about what's going on here just intuitively would be to look at an example of a hurricane. Here's a picture where we take an example of a hurricane that's making landfall in Florida. There you see the red line along the Gulf Coast of Florida where the hurricane's making landfall. Oftentimes you'll see graphs like this where the projected path of the hurricane is formed based on where, according to best model estimates, the hurricane might go after it makes landfill. Now notice that the farther we get from Florida, the wider the area that the curve and the cone of the hurricane takes. The reason for that is we don't know exactly where the hurricane's going to go. We have error built in here. We're going to extrapolate from where we know the hurricane is, and based on what past hurricanes have done, and make a guess about where it might go. The farther from its current place, the more of a guess we have to make. If we go back to this curve that we were talking about before, the farther we get from known cancer data from these chemicals, the more guesswork we have to do to know whether or not we are in fact, or to guess I should say, whether in fact we are going to have a cancer-causing agent. Okay. Here's some statements from the EPA itself about this practice it does called regression lines, going back and trying to guess at low doses what in fact a chemical does. From the Federal Register, the EPA admits that its so-called risk assessments, and that's what it calls these things, risk assessments of chemical-causing cancer agents, or cancer-causing chemical agents, I should say. The EPA does not actually assess actual risk. They admit it. Here's what they say. Such an estimate, however, does not necessarily give a realistic prediction of the risk. The true value of the risk is unknown. Well, I've told you if a risk is unknown, don't call it a risk, call it an uncertainty. And they say that the true value, by which they mean the probability of that risk, may be as low as 0. Well, if the risk of something is 0, it's not a risk. It won't occur. In fact, it's an impossibility. So why are you calling it a risk in the first place? Okay. Here's another point to make about EPA's risk statements that they make that additionally should give us something to think about. Risk assessments by the EPA are intended to protect the public, but they don't predict risk. Here's their quote. As currently done, the final product of risk assessment generally produces numbers that have the illusion of precision, but in fact, this risk assessment process involves many uncertainties. Risk assessment includes judgmental decisions, and each decision is usually made on the conservative side. Therefore, the end result is a product with many conservative judgments and is therefore an estimate of risk, or uncertainty might be a better word to use here, that provides maximum protection of public health. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency also admits that it uses worst-case scenarios in its so-called risk assessments that overestimate the true risk, if any. They say it's not legitimate to use a worst-case scenario to prove that there in fact exists a concern in a real population. It is critical that the results of a worst-case individual scenario are not immediately applied to an entire population, since in almost all cases this will result in a substantial overestimate of a potential problem. In other words, they're saying, don't take our numbers and apply it just willy-nilly to everyone out in society, because we're building in a lot of fudge factors and safety variables into our equations, and so if you were to apply this, the risk would be overstated if there is any risk at all. These conservative risk assessments that they make are policy-driven. They are not scientifically based. Here's their quote. Unfortunately, risk assessment practices continue to rely on conservative models and assumptions that effectively intermingle important policy judgments within the scientific assessment of risk. This policy environment makes it difficult to discern serious hazards from trivial ones. In other words, we don't know what the true risks are. We don't know what the true uncertainties are. We're confused, and therefore it's very hard as a policy matter to make good decisions to manage risk. Risk assessments by the EPA and by many other agencies are usually actually uncertainty assessments, not risk assessments. Here's another quote from the EPA. Estimates of risk often fail to acknowledge the presence of considerable uncertainty, nor do they present the extent to which conservative assumptions overstate likely risks. Decision makers and the general public often incorrectly infer a level of scientific precision and accuracy in the risk assessment process that does not exist. So let's take all of this jargon and put it into an example, because sometimes that helps me to understand what it is they're saying in all this language. Let's take a concrete case of where the EPA might, by example, state a potential risk of some chemical exposure. Let's say there's a toxic chemical spill, and the EPA indicates in a public press release that the risk of this spill of cancer-causing agents is an increase of 2 times 10 to the negative 6, or 2 in a million chances of an increase in risk of cancer as a result of this chemical exposure. What do they mean when they say that? Well, what they really mean, if you read all of their data and their statements and so forth, is that the highest theoretical number of excess cancers in a lifetime in a population due to this chemical spill is 2. 10 to the negative 6 in this case is the size of the population being affected. That means the 2 excess cancers would appear if 1 million people were exposed to this chemical. Now, it's very rare that 1 million people are going to be exposed to a chemical exposure. So 2 would be the highest number if, for example, I live in San Diego, the entire city of San Diego got exposed to the chemical. 2 additional people would, by their estimates, get cancer. But hold on, because 2 is the maximum number, and you're going to see in a minute that even that statement is somewhat misleading. So what do we mean when we say that 2 times 10 to the negative 6 as a population risk exists? What it means is that for 1 million people exposed to this chemical, cancer deaths without exposure to the chemical would be 250,000. Why is that? Well, the reason is because about 1/4 of Americans will die from cancer for no known reason at all. Spontaneously, a quarter of the population, not because of chemical exposures, not because of poisonings or toxicities, but for other background reasons, genetics, too much sun exposure, and so forth, they will get cancer and die. So 250,000 people out of these million are going to get cancer anyway, even if they weren't exposed to the chemical. What we're saying when we have the fact that there is an exposure to a chemical with an increased risk of 2 in a million is that 250,000 people will get cancer, not because of the chemical, but spontaneously, plus because of the chemical exposure, 0, 1, or 2 more will get cancer. In other words, the maximum number of cancer deaths will increase from 250,000 to 250,002. Now, for 100,000 people who are exposed, right, which might be a more realistic exposure level, even that would be a lot of people exposed to a chemical. The cancer deaths with that exposure would not be 250,002, but rather 25,000.2. So only 0.2 additional people would get cancer if only a tenth of the population were exposed to the chemical, as opposed to a million people. But what else we could say by this is that when we say there's a 2 times 10 to the negative 6 or a 2 in a million risk of cancer from this chemical, what the EPA is saying it could mean is that either there are 0 excess cancers per million people exposed, or 1, or 2. They're not sure which, and they admit the answer could be 0, because they drew that line in an arbitrary way and made a guess. But what it does mean is there will not be 3 or more cancers as a result of this exposure. In other words, a risk statement by the Environmental Protection Agency is not the true risk. It is an upper bound on how many cancers in fact will occur. Risk assessments, so-called risk assessments I should say, by the Environmental Protection Agency do not, cannot, and are not intended to tell us what a risk is. Instead, they tell us what a risk isn't. The term safe commonly means without risk. Scientists, however, cannot ascertain conditions under which a given chemical exposure is absolutely without risk of any type. 0 risk is immeasurable. On the other hand, they can describe the condition under which risks are so low as to be considered of no practical consequence to a specific population. The safety of chemical substances has typically been defined as a condition of exposure under which there is a practical certainty that no harm will result to exposed persons. Note that most safe exposure levels established in this way are probably risk-free. But science simply has no tools to prove the existence of essentially a negative condition. This is the EPA's definition of safety. We can't tell you whether these things are risks or not, these chemicals we're studying, particularly at the low doses we're studying them, that the background population of the United States might be exposed to. But what we're going to do is build in a huge safety factor. In fact, I told you before that on highway safeties, the speed limit might drop from 70 to 50. The equivalent analogy for chemicals would be to drop the highway speed limit where we know it's safe from 70 down to 7 miles an hour, or maybe even 0.7 miles an hour. And we would say it's safe to drive at 0.7 miles an hour in your car on this particular stretch of highway. That's the way the EPA thinks about risk. Is that a true risk? No. It's cautionary. It's protecting us against uncertainty, but it's not protecting us against risk. To see this play out in a more amusing way, let's take the Ben & Jerry's dioxin drama. I love ice cream. And in this example, Ben & Jerry's, in one of its promotional statements, talked about the chemical dioxin. Dioxin is classified by the Environmental Protection Agency as a known human carcinogen, but again, they don't have great data when it comes to small amounts of exposure, only in high doses. Here's what Ben & Jerry's says about dioxin. Dioxin is known to cause cancer. In other words, they're saying it's a known risk. Genetic and reproductive defects and learning disabilities. The only safe level of dioxin exposure is no exposure at all. Now, what was interesting about this was some guys went and they got some Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and then they went and estimated based on US government information about the risk of that dioxin. And what they found was that assuming the measurement that these particular scientists did of dioxin in Ben & Jerry's store-sold ice cream right off the shelf is correct, and the sample tested as representative of all of their ice cream, based on the US government's information about the risk, so-called risk, of dioxin, Ben & Jerry's ice cream may cause about 200 cases of cancer among its consumers. Now remember, the answer could be 0, because it's between 200 and 0, according to EPA assessments, that true risk exists. So it could be that by eating Ben & Jerry's ice cream, there's no increased risk of cancer. The answer is 0. Or it could be as high as 200 among all consumers of the ice cream. We just don't know. But what we do know is it's not going to be 201 additional instances of cancer. So what have we just done today? What we basically said is to say that a risk exists, we need to set aside the way that a lot of government agencies throw about the word risk. Instead, as I've said throughout this lecture series, we first need to establish causation before we establish a probability of that causation. If you haven't proven causation about a risk, no matter how good you feel about the probability you are attaching to that thing you are discussing, you are in fact discussing an uncertainty. And so we're back to our original distinction between risks and uncertainties. In the next lecture series, what I'm going to talk about is causation, because we've done enough trying to differentiate risk and uncertainty, but to be able to do that, we need to know how we establish causation. And that's a very complicated topic that will be the subject of many lectures over the next series of classes. I look forward to talking to you. Be sure to look over the discussion questions this week, and I'll see you on the chat boards. Have a good day.